Hello everybody. In this video, we will use slicers on pivot tables in Excel. So we already know pivot tables will allow us to do summary analysis, but we can use slicers with them to filter data and then do summary analysis on that filtered data without having to change or filter the original data set. So let's get started with this. This is the data set that we're going to be working with, and there are some columns that we will use for the pivot table. So let's just go over those columns first. So we will use this column here, item type, sales channel. Sales channel can be offline or online. We will use ship year, which is the year the product was shipped. We will use the month when it was shipped, and we will use this last column here, total profit. So the first step is to create the first pivot table, and then we will use a slicer on it to filter the data. Let's create the first pivot table. For that, I will select all of the data set, click Insert, Pivot Table, From Table. I will select Existing Worksheet, and I will put this pivot table here in Sheet 1. Let's put it here. All right, and then let's create the pivot table here for item type as the rows, sales channel as column, and we will use total profit for the value. So this will be the sum of the total profits. So here is our first pivot table. All right, now let's add a slicer to this. And for that, I will just click anywhere in this pivot table and click Insert, and then click Slicer. And let's now pick a column for the slicer. So first, let's pick the ship year. And I will place this slicer here. Okay. And now we can see if I click on any one of these years, the data will update to show me the summary stats for that year, right? So this is showing me total profit for each of these items by the sales channel, offline or online, for the year 2013. And I can pick different years and the data will update. I can also hold the control key and pick different years. So now it will show me the total profit for all of these years. So I would have to release the control key to do that. So if I release it, as you can see, the total profit values here update. Let's now create a second pivot table that we will connect with the same slicer. So for that, let's go to Sales Record tab here. The data set is already selected. So let's click on Insert, Pivot Table, From Table. And here we will again use the same sheet. And let's put this pivot table here. And let's adjust the zoom so we can see both of these tables once they are created. Okay, so now let's use region for rows, sales channel for column, and total profit here for the values. So this is the second pivot table, and here we're seeing total profit for each of these regions by sales channel. Now we'll notice that if I click on these years here in the first slicer, only the first table is getting updated, and that's because this slicer is not connected to the second pivot table. So let's connect this slicer to the second pivot table, and for that I will just go to the header of this slicer, right click on Report Connections, and here you will notice that we have this pivot table connected here, but the second one, there's no check mark here. So I will just click here, put a check mark. This is our second table. And once we say okay, the second table is now connected to the slicer. So if I select different years here, both the pivot tables will update. And again, I can hold the control key and select different years and then release the control key, and the values will update to reflect the summary data for those years. So this is how you can connect one slicer to multiple pivot tables. Now let's create a second slicer where we will use a different column, and we will connect that slicer to both of these pivot tables. So let's click here in the first pivot table, go to insert, and then click slicer. And this time let's create a slicer for month. And let's place this here. So now if I click these different months, we can see that this table is getting updated, but clearly the second table is not getting updated. So let's now connect this table to this slicer. And again, I can do that the same way. Right click on in the header of this slicer, go to report connections and click check mark this second table here. And so now this table is connected as well. So now I can use both these slicers to get summary data for total profit for my choice of years and months. So let's say I want to pick 2011, 12, 13, and 14, and the last quarter, October, November, and December. I can hold the control key, make these selections, release the control key, and the pivot tables will update. So as you can see, this is extremely useful. You don't need to filter your data anymore. You can connect the slicer to the pivot tables. One thing you probably noticed as I was making these selections for the year and month in these two slicers is that you were seeing a subset of row labels here for item types and regions, and some of the item types for some combinations are sometimes missing. So for example, if I select 2014 and the month of January, you can see that there are items that are not showing, and that's because for these choice of selections here, there is no data contained in them. So let's say that I would like all of the row labels for items as well as regions to show here. And if there's anything, if there's any data that is missing, or let's say the total profit is zero, or there is no data for the selected year and month, we would still like to see blank cells for those items. So those items should appear and they can have blank cells, and that's fine. So we can do that. And the way to do that is let's click here in the first pivot table and then click on item type under rows, and then click field settings, and then click layout and print. And there's a choice here for showing items with no data. So show items with no data. I'm going to check mark this. Okay. And now you can see that it's showing all of the items, even if they have no data for the selections that you've made, it's still showing them all. And you need to repeat it for the second pivot table. So I'll repeat it for this table. Click on field settings, layout and print, and then show items with no data. Okay. And now we're seeing all row labels for region as well as items, even if they don't have any data for the selections that you've made. Okay, and now I can go back to selecting the years that I would like to select, and the data will populate. Next, what if we want, instead of showing empty cells here, what if we want to show the value of 0, for example? So 0 would represent either there was no profit for the combination of items and sales channel, as well as region and sales channel, or that even if there was no data for the selection that you've made, we would just like to see 0 instead of a blank cell. So the way to do that is, let's first pick this first pivot table. Click on this header here, right click, pivot table options. And here there is an option for empty cells show, and I can just type anything here. So I'll type 0. And what this will do is, instead of showing blank cells, it will now show 0. And I can do the same here for the second pivot table. So let's go here, right click, pivot table options, and for empty cells show 0. Okay, and now I'm showing zeros in blank instead of blank cells, and this should complete the exercise. So now I can do any selections here, and it will update the cells. So if there are values, it will show the value. If there are any empty cells, it will just show zeros.